Imagine waking up one day, decades into a life you've meticulously planned, only to realize everything you counted on might never come true. What if the retirement you envisioned, the quiet mornings, the trips, the freedom, was never actually within reach? What if all those assumptions about pensions, savings, and the stability of the system were built on shifting sand? Across the United States, millions of people are edging closer to retirement age, believing they have time, believing the decades of diligent saving will protect them, but beneath the surface, hidden forces are at play. Complex economic systems, volatile markets, the erosion of social safety nets, all quietly reshaping what it means to grow old in America. History shows us that financial crises are rarely isolated events, they ripple, echo, and cascade across generations. And yet, most families never see the signs until it's too late, until the sudden collapse of expectation meets the harsh reality of survival. What if your parents' sacrifices, your grandparents' frugality, even your own careful planning, were not enough? The risk is not just economic, it's existential. Security, independence, dignity in one's later years, these are not guarantees, but fragile constructs. By exploring one American family's story, through decades of boom and bust, prosperity and uncertainty, we uncover the hidden patterns that define the lives of millions. You'll see the cracks in the system, and maybe recognize them in your own life. Stay with us, and discover why the retirement dream you've been chasing could already be slipping through your fingers. It begins in a small town in Ohio. 1952, the post-war boom at its peak, the air filled with optimism, industry humming in every corner, the streets lined with modest houses, freshly painted, each garden a testament to pride and effort. In one such house, the Miller family lived, a young couple with 2 children, hoping that the American dream would carry them through life, untouched by hardship. George Miller, the father, had returned from the war with a sturdy back, a careful mind, and a job at the local steel mill. Margaret Miller, his wife, managed the household, balancing work at the local diner with raising their children, Helen and Robert. They spoke often of the future, of savings accounts, homeownership, college funds. But even in these hopeful discussions, there was an undercurrent they could not name, a fragile trust in systems far larger than themselves. The steel mill, the beating heart of the town's economy, was thriving, for now. Yet, within its walls, decisions were being made in offices far removed from the factory floor, decisions that would ripple outward in ways no one could predict. Machines, labor contracts, supply chains, all interwoven with global markets, trade agreements, and policies set in distant cities. Few realized that their daily work was part of a fragile lattice, one that could, and eventually would, shift beneath their feet. Helen, only 10 years old, watched her father every evening, his hands scarred from labor, his eyes tired yet resolute. She learned early about sacrifice, about the invisible threads connecting effort to reward. Robert, 2 years younger, absorbed the small joys of childhood, the baseball games, the neighborhood ice cream parlor, but he also sensed the quiet anxiety that sometimes crossed Margaret's face when bills arrived. These early lessons would shape their understanding of security, independence, and eventually, disappointment. By the mid-1950s, the Millers had achieved what most families considered stable, a home, steady employment, modest savings. Yet the world around them was shifting in ways subtle but inexorable. Inflation began to creep in, wages adjusted slowly, and whispers of industrial consolidation floated through town halls and diner conversations. Even as the Millers celebrated small victories, a new car, a family vacation, there were forces at work beyond their vision, forces that could undo decades of careful planning. In 1957, the first signs became visible. George's steel mill reduced overtime unexpectedly, citing market adjustments. Margaret noticed the difference immediately in their checkbook. The extra hours that had padded their monthly budget simply vanished. Conversations in the diner hinted at larger concerns, competitors closing plants, investors pushing for efficiency, a fragile confidence in the post-war economy being tested. Helen, now 15, felt the tension, the unspoken worry that their stability might not be as permanent as she believed. Robert, at 13, asked questions that adults deflected. Why did Mr. Thompson, the neighbor, suddenly sell his house and leave town? Why were the mills talking about layoffs? The answers were incomplete, elusive, like smoke slipping through fingers. By 1960, George had secured a promotion, a supervisor position that promised higher pay and increased responsibility. Yet with it came longer hours, more stress, and the first encounters with the bureaucracy that would later define the American working experience. Contracts, pension plans, insurance policies, he signed documents he could not fully understand, trusting in the advice of bank managers and union representatives. Margaret, ever diligent, balanced the books at home, yet even she felt the unease that comes with uncertainty. For every dollar saved, there seemed a hidden counterweight, invisible yet present, in the form of economic shifts, political decisions, and global events beyond their control. The 1960s brought the Millers both joy and upheaval. Helen graduated high school, a scholarship to Ohio State in hand, the culmination of years of careful planning and sacrifice. Robert followed in her footsteps, though with a more cautious temperament, always observing, always questioning. Yet as the decade progressed, the world around them became unpredictable. Steel plants faced foreign competition, inflation rose, strikes disrupted production. Even the most conservative assumptions, steady employment, predictable wages, were proving increasingly fragile. It was in 1968, during a particularly harsh winter, that the first serious threat to their retirement dreams emerged. George returned home one night, his face pale beneath the steel cap of his hard hat. The union had called an emergency meeting, layoffs were imminent, a direct response to falling demand and corporate restructuring. Margaret, clutching her knitting, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. For the first time, she recognized the stark reality: decades of careful planning could be undone in a single decision, made by faceless executives far removed from their daily lives. Helen and Robert watched their parents navigate this crisis, absorbing lessons that textbooks could never teach. They learned about vulnerability, about reliance on structures over which they had no control, about the unpredictable forces that govern even the most seemingly stable lives. Conversations over the dinner table became cautious, strategic, discussions of survival rather than comfort. In the winter of 1969, a letter arrived from the mill. George's position was secure, for now. But the company announced an unexpected early retirement incentive, offering a lump sum to senior employees willing to step aside. It was framed as opportunity, yet George saw it for what it was: a subtle shift, a test of loyalty, a hedge against economic uncertainty. The family debated the decision for days. Accepting the offer could mean a temporary cushion, but it also risked long-term security, a gamble in a game whose rules were opaque and evolving. As the Millers weighed their choices, shadows began to gather outside the windows of their home: layoffs in neighboring towns, local businesses closing, whispers of recession and inflation growing louder. The delicate lattice of work, savings, and trust trembled under forces they could not see. And in the minds of Helen and Robert, a question began to form, one that would follow them for decades: what if all the careful planning, all the sacrifices, were insufficient? It was in that winter, with snow piling against the windowpanes and the wind cutting across the empty streets, that the Millers received a visit from an unexpected messenger, a man in a suit from the mill's headquarters, briefcase in hand, offering a proposition that would test their assumptions, their faith in the system, and ultimately, their vision of a secure future. The words he spoke hinted at opportunity, but carried the unmistakable weight of risk, the kind that could redefine an entire lifetime. And as the door closed behind him, Margaret looked at George and whispered, almost to herself, "We may not get another chance, but do we even understand what we're risking?" The answer would come, in ways none of them could yet imagine, and it would set in motion events that would reverberate across generations, shaping not just their retirement dreams, but the very foundation of what they believed security could mean. The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the snowstorm outside intensified, and the first cracks in their carefully constructed world began to show, faint yet undeniable. The snowstorm lingered longer than expected, drifting against the windows in thick, suffocating layers, muffling the town, isolating the Millers in a cocoon of white. Inside, the fire crackled, but warmth was sparse, not just in degrees but in certainty. George sat at the kitchen table, the letter from the mill spread before him, Margaret beside him with a weary hand on his shoulder. Helen and Robert lingered nearby, sensing the gravity in every glance, every pause, every unspoken fear. The man's visit had left more questions than answers. He had spoken of early retirement packages, of restructuring, of opportunities framed in corporate optimism. But George, whose hands had shaped steel and whose eyes had witnessed the rise and fall of factories, read between the lines. Opportunity, or risk. Reward, or trap. The lines blurred. One misstep could unravel decades of labor, savings, and careful planning. And in that moment, George felt the invisible threads tightening, the same threads that would bind every future decision, every hope, every dream. The following months were tense, a slow unraveling disguised as ordinary life. George attended meetings, signing forms, negotiating clauses he barely understood, while Margaret navigated the household budget with surgical precision. The children watched, learning early about uncertainty, about the subtle erosion of control. Helen, now 16, began working part-time at the diner, both to help and to feel useful, to assert agency in a world where adults wielded power in ways she could not yet comprehend. Robert, shy and observant, spent hours in the local library, devouring books on economics, history, and social change, as though knowledge could shield him from the coming storm. By summer, whispers in the town became louder, layoffs, mergers, factories closing doors that had never closed before. The Millers' neighbors, the Thompsons and the Harrisons, spoke in hushed tones about debts, foreclosures, and moves to distant cities for work. Helen overheard one diner conversation that chilled her. People think they're secure, until the market shifts, then it's just survival. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of prophecy. Security, they realized, was not guaranteed, it was a fragile illusion, dependent on forces few could predict, and fewer control. In 1970, the first shock hit. George was offered the early retirement package, again framed as choice, as opportunity. The sum seemed generous, enough to consider a comfortable life, to step back from the factory floor, to pursue hobbies, maybe travel, even invest. But the fine print was dense, layered with clauses that suggested volatility, unpredictability, and hidden risk. Margaret read it twice, her brow furrowed, intuition telling her that the apparent certainty was anything but certain. The family convened in the living room late one night. The fire had dwindled to embers, the snowstorm long since passed, leaving the world outside washed in bright, blinding sunlight, deceptively peaceful. Helen and Robert listened as George and Margaret debated the offer, their voices low but charged with urgency. Accepting could provide immediate relief, a lump sum that might ease stress. Declining could preserve longer-term security, but who knew what the future held? Inflation, market fluctuations, political instability, even the smallest tremor could amplify into catastrophe. As the argument stretched on, a sudden knock at the door interrupted them. Helen jumped, her heart racing, as George rose cautiously. Outside, a man in a dark coat and hat stood in the sunlight, face unreadable, a briefcase clutched in one hand. Without waiting for an invitation, he handed George a single sheet of paper, then turned and walked away before anyone could speak. The note was brief, typed in stark, formal lettering: reconsider. Your assumptions are flawed. Time is moving faster than you realize. No signature, no explanation, just those chilling words. Margaret read them aloud, voice trembling, and Helen and Robert felt an unfamiliar fear, the sense that the world was larger than they had imagined, and perhaps more dangerous. George's hands tightened on the paper, knuckles white. The choice that had seemed daunting moments ago now carried an almost existential weight. Their retirement dreams, their sense of stability, had been called into question by forces they could not name, forces that seemed to lurk in the margins of daily life, in the cracks of policy, in the invisible architecture of finance and industry. The following weeks were a blur of anxiety and calculation. George met with accountants, lawyers, and union representatives. Margaret consulted friends and neighbors, seeking insight into how others had navigated similar dilemmas. Helen and Robert observed quietly, absorbing lessons not in textbooks but in tension, in the subtle ways adults wrestled with uncertainty, in the quiet, almost invisible ways a family's future could hinge on a single decision. By late 1971, George decided to accept the early retirement package. The sum, invested cautiously, promised a modest but reliable income, enough to sustain the family if no further disruptions occurred. Margaret, though relieved, remained wary. An unshakable intuition whispered that the promise of safety was conditional, ephemeral. Helen and Robert learned from their parents' deliberation that even careful planning could not fully inoculate against risk, that stability was a negotiation with forces beyond the home, beyond the town, even beyond the state. But life rarely pauses to allow understanding. In early 1972, news arrived from Washington. New policies were being debated that would affect pensions, taxation, and social welfare programs. Local banks began issuing cautious advisories. Inflation, long dormant, started to creep upward. And in the Millers' own community, a small steel plant announced sudden layoffs, triggering panic among families who had believed themselves secure. Helen, now 19, felt a growing unease, a sense that the decisions of adults, however well-intentioned, were always vulnerable to unseen forces. Robert, at 17, became obsessed with tracking economic trends, mapping market shifts, calculating probabilities, as though knowledge alone could grant foresight. But the family's internal calculus could only extend so far. Beyond a certain point, unpredictability dominated. The first real crisis arrived in 1973. George's investments, though conservative, were hit by an unexpected downturn in the steel market. The lump sum meant to secure their retirement lost value, sharply and suddenly. Margaret's careful budgeting was no longer sufficient, savings dwindled faster than anticipated. The family felt the shock not just financially, but psychologically. Stability, once assumed, had dissolved into uncertainty. They gathered around the kitchen table one evening, the same table that had borne decades of planning, debate, and hope. The air was thick with tension, with disbelief. Helen's voice trembled as she asked the question that had been forming for years: were we ever really safe, or did we just believe we were? George had no answer. Margaret could only offer a quiet, wary nod. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a fragile raft in a storm-tossed sea, and the horizon outside promised more turbulence. As summer approached, the Millers learned that the local steel plant would permanently close in 2 years. Former colleagues were scrambling, some leaving town entirely. Social networks, carefully maintained over decades, fractured under pressure. The illusion of stability, painstakingly built through work, sacrifice, and faith in the system, was fading. And as Helen and Robert observed the shifting world, the family realized that survival required more than effort. It demanded adaptability, foresight, and sometimes, sheer courage. One evening, Helen received a phone call from an unexpected source, a distant relative in Chicago, offering an opportunity that seemed promising yet carried its own risks. The conversation was brief, tantalizing, enough to plant a seed of possibility and anxiety. Margaret watched her daughter with a mixture of hope and dread, sensing that the next decision might define not just the next decade, but the family's long-term trajectory. And in that instant, as the phone clicked silent, a new question took root in the Millers' minds, unspoken but undeniable: could the choices they had made, under pressure, under uncertainty, ever truly protect them from the forces moving silently around them, forces that could dismantle decades of planning with a single, unforeseen event. The answer was still out there, waiting, patient, and the next twist in their journey would come sooner than any of them anticipated. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows, carrying a whisper of change, a promise of upheaval, and the Millers realized, with a shiver, that their carefully constructed world was about to be tested once more, in ways none of them could yet foresee. The Millers face a sudden, unexpected opportunity in Chicago, promising yet dangerous, setting the stage for their next major decision, which could reshape their entire future. The call from Chicago lingered in Helen's mind for days, its promise and peril intertwined, impossible to separate. The city, far larger and more chaotic than their quiet Ohio town, represented both hope and danger. The opportunity was simple in words, a job in a family-owned manufacturing firm, modest pay at first, but with potential for growth, connections, and stability in a world where the Millers' hometown offered little beyond uncertainty. Yet the distance, the unknown, and the risk of uprooting their lives loomed like a shadow over every consideration. George and Margaret debated the proposal with the seriousness it demanded. The winter of 1973 had stripped away illusions, leaving only the raw necessity of adaptability. George worried about the strain on the family, about the logistics, about whether the move might be trading one precarious situation for another. Margaret, who had guided the household with precision and foresight for decades, weighed the practicalities, housing, cost of living, the children's schooling, the integrity of their savings. Helen, however, saw it as a chance to reclaim agency, to step into a world that offered possibility rather than decline. Robert, still in high school, oscillated between excitement and fear, aware that leaving Ohio would mean stepping into unfamiliar territory, where the safety nets of community and family familiarity no longer existed. By spring, the Millers had made their decision. Helen would move to Chicago first, to test the waters, secure a foothold, and determine whether the opportunity was real or merely an illusion. George and Margaret would remain behind temporarily, ensuring that the house, finances, and family network remained intact, while Robert finished high school. The plan was cautious, yet even with careful planning, risk was undeniable, because the forces shaping economic stability were relentless, unseen, and unyielding. Helen arrived in Chicago in May of 1974. The city was alive with energy, noise, and motion, factories humming, streets congested with cars and buses, voices layered over one another in a constant, discordant symphony. She rented a small apartment above a bakery, the smell of yeast and bread drifting into her evenings, a reminder that life continued in cycles, even in a new and intimidating environment. The firm where she had been offered employment was small but well managed, producing specialized machinery for the automotive industry. The owner, a stoic man in his 60s, greeted her with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, measuring whether this small-town girl could navigate the demands of urban labor, corporate politics, and the unpredictable pressures of industry. Helen's first weeks were exhausting, the pace relentless, the learning curve steep. She processed invoices, observed production lines, and slowly began to understand the delicate interplay between supply, demand, labor, and management decisions that governed not just her job, but the livelihoods of countless others. Chicago was a microcosm of forces she had only glimpsed in Ohio, larger, faster, and far more interconnected. Decisions made in boardrooms could ripple across the city, affecting lives in ways almost imperceptible until the consequences hit. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, George and Margaret navigated their own adjustments. George, retired early but still driven by routine and responsibility, became involved in local volunteer work, offering guidance to younger men entering the steel industry. Margaret took on occasional bookkeeping for neighbors, ensuring that the family's finances remained steady, even as inflation gnawed at their savings. Both of them, however, carried an undercurrent of unease, a recognition that even careful planning could be undone by factors beyond their control, economic shifts, policy changes, or even chance events. By summer, Helen began to see patterns. Chicago was a city of opportunity, but also of fragility. The firm's orders depended on contracts with larger manufacturers, whose priorities could change overnight. Labor disputes, supply chain delays, and unexpected regulatory shifts constantly threatened to disrupt what seemed secure. Helen understood, in ways she could not articulate fully, that her parents' struggles in Ohio were a lesson, a prelude to the challenges she now faced. Security was conditional, trust was provisional, and every decision carried both possibility and peril. In September, a crisis emerged. One of the firm's largest clients unexpectedly canceled an order due to budget cuts, leaving the company scrambling to fill the gap. Helen worked late nights, reorganizing schedules, contacting smaller suppliers, and improvising solutions. The pressure revealed her capacity for resilience, for negotiation, for problem-solving under duress. Yet it also underscored a truth she had known since childhood: the world's systems, economic and social, were unpredictable, and preparation could only mitigate, not eliminate, risk. Back in Ohio, George received an unexpected letter from the bank managing his retirement savings. The stock market, already volatile, had plunged further, eroding a portion of the lump sum that had once seemed secure. Margaret reviewed the statement with a tightening chest, recognizing that even cautious planning could falter under forces far larger than one family. Robert, now 17, absorbed the news with a mix of anxiety and resolve, determined that he would not rely solely on external structures for his future. Education, he concluded, and adaptability were the tools that might allow him to navigate a world so often at the mercy of events beyond control. By winter, Helen had begun to establish herself in Chicago. She forged relationships with colleagues, earned the respect of supervisors, and began to contribute in ways that went beyond her formal responsibilities. Yet the city's pace, the unpredictability of contracts, and the looming threats of broader economic shifts kept her vigilant. She began to understand that opportunity was never purely positive, it was entangled with risk, and the two were inseparable. Then, in early 1975, a new development jolted the family. Helen's firm received notice of a potential buyout by a larger corporation. The announcement was cautious, vague, but the implications were immense. Buyouts could mean growth, stability, and access to resources, or layoffs, restructuring, and upheaval. Helen, confronted with the uncertainty, realized that her personal trajectory, and that of the family, was subject to the whims of forces far beyond her control. She recalled the snowstorm in Ohio years earlier, the mysterious visitor, the early retirement package, and recognized that history was not linear, but cyclical. Patterns repeated, and families, no matter how careful, were often caught in these recurring storms. George and Margaret debated whether to move to Chicago, to join Helen and solidify family support, or to remain in Ohio, preserving stability in the familiar. The decision was agonizing, revealing the limits of foresight and planning. Each scenario carried promise and peril, each choice shaped by factors invisible yet decisive. In conversations that stretched long into the night, they acknowledged the cruel irony: the more they attempted to secure a future, the more they became aware of the fragility of all they had built. The turning point came in April of 1975. Helen received a call from the corporate headquarters. The buyout was proceeding, and employees would be notified individually regarding their positions. The language was formal, impersonal, a stark reminder that human lives and plans were subordinate to corporate imperatives. Helen's heart raced as she considered the consequences. A promotion, relocation, or termination could arrive in hours, and with it, the stability she and her family had fought to secure could vanish. That night, Helen sat alone in her small apartment, city lights flickering through the window, the hum of traffic a constant backdrop. She reflected on her parents' sacrifices, on the lessons learned in Ohio, and on the unpredictable nature of life. Every assumption, every plan, seemed contingent, fragile, almost ephemeral. And as she prepared for sleep, a sense of foreboding settled over her. The storm was not in the snow or the wind, but in the structures of economy and society themselves, and she understood, viscerally, that her family's future would soon be tested in ways none of them could fully anticipate. The phone rang at midnight. Helen answered, voice trembling, and a single sentence on the line made her blood run cold. "You've been selected for immediate transition. Pack your things. Decisions must be made by dawn." In that moment, the rhythm of life, carefully managed, seemed to pause. The next steps, unknown, uncertain, irreversible, loomed larger than any choices made before. The Chicago opportunity, once a beacon, had become a crucible, a test of courage, adaptability, and the hard truth that stability is often an illusion, however diligently pursued. And as Helen stared at the phone, trembling, the city outside continued its indifferent motion, unaware that one family's life hung in the balance. Helen must make an immediate, high-stakes decision in Chicago that could secure or destroy the family's future, leaving the audience in suspense. The night air in Chicago was thick with humidity and tension, the distant wail of sirens cutting through the urban din, the glow of streetlights reflecting off rain-slick pavement. Helen sat on the edge of her bed, the phone still warm from her grip, her mind spinning in endless permutations. Every scenario seemed plausible, every choice, a potential turning point. The corporate buyout offered promotion, relocation, or termination. One decision, one signature, could redefine everything the Millers had built over decades. Helen ran through the options. Accept the promotion, relocate to the new headquarters, risk isolation but gain influence, or decline, maintain familiarity, but face potential exclusion from the firm's future. Each path carried risk. Each carried promise. The city outside seemed indifferent to her anxiety, a vast organism moving according to laws she could only glimpse, laws shaped by markets, contracts, labor unions, and decisions made by men and women whose names she would never know. By dawn, Helen had made a choice. She accepted the promotion and the relocation. The decision was not born of certainty, but of necessity, a recognition that in a world where stability was fragile, inaction could be more dangerous than action. She packed swiftly, her hands trembling, aware that the outcome of this choice would reverberate far beyond her immediate circumstances. The weight of the family's sacrifices, the early lessons from Ohio, pressed upon her shoulders like a mantle she could not discard. George and Margaret received the news with mixed relief and apprehension. The city had always seemed a distant place, vibrant but perilous. Now, their daughter was moving deeper into that complexity, carrying the hopes, the dreams, and the vulnerabilities of the entire family. Margaret packed Helen's essentials with care, noting every detail that might ease the transition, a photograph of the Ohio home, a favorite cookbook, letters from friends. George offered pragmatic advice, emphasizing vigilance, adaptability, and the unspoken truth that the systems governing life were often indifferent to effort, loyalty, or morality. Helen arrived at the new headquarters in late May. The building was modern, imposing, and efficient, the floors polished, the offices gleaming, the hum of machinery and activity omnipresent. The atmosphere was intense, disciplined, yet teetering on the edge of chaos. Managers moved briskly through hallways, carrying memos and directives, their eyes sharp, their expressions unreadable. Helen felt a surge of adrenaline, the same mixture of fear and possibility that had accompanied her move from Ohio. Her first days were a baptism by fire. She navigated complex production schedules, reconciled orders, mediated disputes between departments, and learned the subtle hierarchies of corporate power. Each decision, each interaction, had consequences. She observed the delicate balance between labor and management, profit and sustainability, ambition and ethics. Helen began to understand that opportunity was inseparable from risk, that every advantage carried hidden costs, often invisible until disaster struck. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, Robert prepared for high school graduation. The shadow of his sister's move loomed over the household. He studied tirelessly, motivated by the awareness that education, adaptability, and foresight were his most reliable tools against a world that had proven capricious. George and Margaret continued their careful management of finances, mindful that their daughter's success, or misstep, in Chicago would affect the family's broader security. By midsummer, Helen's role in the firm expanded. She was tasked with coordinating a critical new project, a series of precision machines for an automotive client with strict deadlines and exacting standards. The pressure was relentless. Errors could result in financial penalties, reputational damage, or lost contracts. Helen thrived in the challenge, but the intensity underscored the vulnerability of her position. She realized that control was always partial, fleeting, that even diligence, skill, and intelligence could be rendered insufficient by forces beyond her influence. Then came the warning signs. One morning, the company's lead engineer arrived at Helen's office, face drawn, eyes wary. Production materials had been delayed from overseas suppliers. Tariffs and import restrictions had shifted unexpectedly, affecting both cost and schedule. Orders would be late, clients frustrated, and profits threatened. Helen felt a familiar surge of anxiety, tempered by the lessons of Ohio. Stability, she understood, was a fragile illusion, one that demanded constant vigilance, rapid adaptation, and unflinching decision-making. The economic tremors reached further. The national news reported rising inflation, energy crises, and shifts in trade policy. Chicago's labor unions were organizing strikes in nearby plants, pressuring management and disrupting supply chains. Helen recognized a pattern: systems that appeared robust could collapse under pressure, and the personal stakes of those collapses could be catastrophic. She had seen it in her parents, in the layoffs in Ohio. Now, she was living it herself, navigating the immediate consequences of forces both local and global. By early autumn, Helen's efforts were paying off. The machines were delivered, contracts fulfilled, clients appeased. The firm's leadership acknowledged her skill, and she began to gain influence, negotiating terms, managing budgets, and coordinating operations. Yet with each success came new challenges: corporate consolidation, changing regulatory frameworks, and the constant threat of disruption from competitors. Helen felt the weight of responsibility pressing ever heavier, aware that her decisions did not just affect her career, but the broader trajectory of her family. At the same time, a personal complication emerged. Helen discovered irregularities in the firm's accounting practices, expenses that seemed unexplained, contracts that appeared manipulated, and procurement orders that raised ethical questions. Reporting these issues could stabilize operations, but risked her position, her safety, and her prospects within the company. She faced a moral dilemma: act and potentially jeopardize everything, or ignore the irregularities and risk long-term consequences for both the firm and herself. Back in Ohio, George received news of the firm's growing challenges through Helen's letters and phone calls. Margaret, increasingly anxious, feared that the city's intensity, combined with unforeseen risks, might overwhelm their daughter. Robert, newly graduated, contemplated his own future. He understood that the choices made now, by Helen, by George and Margaret, would echo through decades, influencing not only wealth, but stability, opportunity, and the family's very survival. Helen made her choice. She reported the irregularities to upper management, documenting each anomaly with meticulous care. The response was immediate: leadership praised her vigilance, but the scrutiny intensified. Audits, meetings, and investigations followed. Helen's position became both more powerful and more precarious. Success now carried visibility, and visibility carried risk. She realized, with a cold clarity, that opportunity and danger were inseparable, one always shadowed the other. Then, one evening, a late message arrived from the firm's headquarters. A high-level executive requested an urgent meeting, in person, at a location far outside the usual office environment. The instructions were cryptic: no details, no context, only the necessity of attendance. Helen sensed the stakes immediately. This was not routine. This was a test, one that could redefine her career, her influence, and the family's security in Chicago and Ohio alike. As Helen prepared to leave, the city outside was alive with motion and indifference. The streets, the lights, the ceaseless hum of activity, all moved according to forces larger than any one individual. And Helen understood that she was entering a crucible, one that would demand judgment, courage, and perhaps sacrifice. The night seemed to hold its breath. The winds shifted, the traffic paused in an instant of cinematic suspension, and Helen stepped into the unknown, unaware that the choices she made in the next hour would ripple across her family's life, shaping their fortunes, their security, and their understanding of what it truly meant to survive in a world where stability is always conditional. The phone in her pocket buzzed. A message blinked on the screen. Do not trust appearances. Decisions now will echo for generations. Helen swallowed hard. Outside, Chicago's lights flickered like distant stars, indifferent, yet ominously prophetic. She walked toward the unknown, aware that the next moments would define everything. Helen is summoned to a mysterious, high-stakes meeting by corporate executives, with potential consequences that could affect her career and the entire family's future, leaving the audience in suspense. Helen stepped into the lobby of the high-rise, the marble floors cold beneath her shoes, the echo of her footsteps amplified by the cavernous space. Security cameras tracked every motion, elevators hummed mechanically, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cologne. The instructions were clear: the meeting would occur in a private boardroom on the top floor, and no one was to accompany her. The isolation felt deliberate, a subtle reminder that this was no ordinary corporate matter, but a confrontation with power, with stakes far higher than she had anticipated. Ascending the elevator, Helen reflected on the months since leaving Ohio. Every challenge, every decision, every moment of vigilance had led to this point. She recalled the snowstorm that had forced her parents to confront vulnerability, the early retirement gamble that had reshaped her family's understanding of security, and the chaotic weeks in Chicago that had tested her adaptability, patience, and judgment. Each lesson had been hard-won, and now, in the city's steel and glass heart, she was to confront the ultimate test. The boardroom door opened, revealing a room bathed in artificial light, the walls lined with glossy wood panels. Four executives sat around a long table, their expressions unreadable. Helen noticed the subtle hierarchy in their seating, the way glances were exchanged, the calculated rhythm of their gestures. She was asked to sit at the head of the table, a signal that both authority and scrutiny would fall upon her in equal measure. The conversation began cautiously. The executives outlined a proposal. Helen's skills and insight had been recognized, and they wished to offer her a pivotal role in the restructuring of the firm. The position promised influence, higher salary, and visibility. Yet beneath the formal language was an unmistakable undertone of threat: accept, and navigate the pressures, refuse, and her trajectory, and perhaps the stability of her family's future, could be imperiled. Every phrase was calibrated, every pause intentional, designed to test resolve as much as intelligence. Helen listened carefully, analyzing the implications. The offer was real, but the consequences of acceptance or refusal were opaque. She realized immediately that her decision would not only affect her career but the Millers' finances, their sense of security, and the broader network of relationships spanning Ohio and Chicago. Accepting could solidify influence and access, yet it might also expose her to scrutiny, moral compromises, and vulnerabilities she could not anticipate. Declining would maintain distance, but risk marginalization in a rapidly consolidating firm, and possibly sever channels that her family had relied upon for stability. After hours of discussion, the executives left her alone with the decision, signaling urgency. A response was required by morning. Helen returned to her apartment, the city lights flickering through rain-streaked windows, the hum of traffic outside a persistent reminder of forces beyond her control. She sat at her desk, reviewing her notes, calculations, and projections. Every possible outcome seemed uncertain, every scenario carried risk. The cumulative weight of family expectations, economic instability, and personal ambition pressed heavily on her. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, George and Margaret sensed the tension, even from hundreds of miles away. Their correspondence with Helen had been frequent, cautious, and deliberately coded, each line hinting at pressure and importance without revealing the full scope of events. Robert, increasingly aware of the fragility of systems and the consequences of individual decisions, began contemplating his own path. He recognized, as Helen had, that opportunity was rarely divorced from risk, that the illusions of stability were often punctuated by abrupt, unforeseeable disruptions. That night, Helen made her decision. She would accept the role, fully aware of the attendant risks. Her choice was strategic, informed by months of observation and experience. She drafted her response with care, submitting it electronically to the firm, knowing that the next steps would test not just her professional aptitude, but her resilience, judgment, and capacity for risk management. The following morning, the firm responded. Helen was accepted into the executive team, with immediate integration into key projects and decision-making channels. The news was exhilarating, yet daunting. She realized that visibility came with scrutiny, and every choice she made would reverberate far beyond her immediate environment, potentially affecting her family's security and the firm's operations. In the weeks that followed, Helen immersed herself in her new responsibilities. She traveled frequently, negotiated contracts, mediated disputes, and analyzed financial data that connected the firm to global markets. The scale and complexity of her work dwarfed anything she had encountered in Ohio, and the stakes became increasingly clear. One miscalculation could imperil not just her position, but the financial well-being of her family. Simultaneously, George faced his own crisis. The erosion of their retirement fund continued, driven by inflation and market volatility. Margaret's meticulous budgeting became ever more critical, each dollar accounted for, each expense scrutinized. The family's survival was increasingly dependent on Helen's success in Chicago, a reality that weighed heavily on all of them. Robert, still observing, began preparing for college, aware that personal initiative would be essential in navigating a world where traditional safeguards, steady employment, pensions, and savings, were no longer guaranteed. Then, in late 1975, the first ripple of unforeseen consequences struck. One of the firm's long-standing clients filed a lawsuit, alleging breach of contract. Helen was pulled into meetings, interrogations, and emergency strategy sessions. Decisions had to be made quickly, legal counsel had to be consulted, financial exposure calculated, and operational adjustments implemented. The lawsuit threatened revenue streams critical not just to the firm, but to Helen's credibility and influence within the executive team. The situation was volatile, the outcome uncertain, and the stakes impossibly high. Back in Ohio, the Millers felt the tension indirectly but acutely. Letters from Helen were terse, updates from banks frequent but unsettling, and each conversation seemed to carry undercurrents of anxiety and responsibility. The early lessons of Ohio, about the fragility of planning, the unpredictability of markets, the invisibility of systemic forces, resonated now with new intensity. George and Margaret understood that their daughter's choices were intertwined with their own survival, and the generational chain of risk and responsibility had been laid bare. Amid this, Helen discovered a pattern. The irregularities she had noted months earlier were more than simple bookkeeping errors. They indicated a network of inefficiencies and manipulations that, if left unchecked, could jeopardize not only the lawsuit but the firm's entire financial stability. Helen realized that she had a decision to make: confront the irregularities directly, potentially destabilizing the company and her position, or delay action, risking larger consequences later. She chose confrontation. Detailed reports were compiled, meetings convened, and adjustments mandated. The immediate outcome was disruptive: teams were reassigned, schedules altered, and tensions escalated. Yet the intervention stabilized operations in the medium term, preventing a potential collapse of contracts and preserving revenue streams. Helen's influence solidified, but she now understood viscerally that every decision carried amplified consequences, and every action was observed, analyzed, and judged. In Ohio, George and Margaret faced their own reckoning. The family home, once a symbol of stability, required unexpected repairs. Medical bills for neighbors and friends, inflation-adjusted expenses, and the ongoing volatility of investments created an ever-tightening squeeze on resources. Robert, inspired by Helen's resilience, intensified his studies, seeking the tools to navigate an uncertain world. The family's reality was stark. The illusion of security had been stripped away, leaving only vigilance, adaptability, and courage. By early 1976, Helen had become indispensable to the firm. Her successes were lauded, her insights valued. Yet the work was unrelenting, the pressure constant. The firm's interconnectedness with global markets meant that every ripple, policy changes, international crises, supply chain disruptions, was magnified. Helen understood, as she had never fully realized in Ohio, that stability was not granted, it was earned daily, defended fiercely, and always contingent on factors beyond her control. And then, one evening, a late message arrived from the executive suite. Immediate travel required. Unforeseen circumstances. Depart at 0300. Helen's pulse quickened. The message was cryptic, urgent, an unmistakable signal that another crucible awaited, one that would test her judgment, resilience, and capacity to navigate uncertainty under extreme pressure. She packed quickly, aware that every moment counted, that delays could have consequences, and that this journey, like all of her previous choices, would ripple outward, affecting not just her own life, but the Millers' collective future. The city outside was quiet, deceptively so. Streetlights shimmered on wet asphalt, and the distant hum of activity seemed almost muted. Yet Helen felt the tension in every fiber of her being. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with risk, and charged with consequences she could neither fully see nor control. And as she stepped into a waiting car, the skyline behind her flickered with light and shadow, a city indifferent to the struggles of a single family, yet inexorably shaping their fate. Helen receives an urgent, mysterious assignment requiring immediate travel, introducing a new crisis with potential to affect her career, her family's financial security, and the Millers' understanding of stability itself. The car moved through the early morning streets of Chicago, wet asphalt reflecting neon signs and the occasional taxi's headlights, the city still largely asleep, yet already teeming with potential dangers and invisible pressures. Helen sat rigid, clutching her briefcase, mind racing through every possible scenario. The executive message had been abrupt, cryptic, unforeseen circumstances, immediate travel. No destination, no details, only urgency. Every instinct told her that this was more than a routine corporate matter. Every fiber of her being understood that the stakes could ripple far beyond her own career, beyond Chicago, perhaps even touching Ohio, the Millers' home, and her family's fragile security. By 4 a.m., the car arrived at the airport. A private jet waited, sleek and imposing. Helen boarded without question, the hum of the engines a mechanical lullaby as the plane ascended into a gray dawn. She could not see the landscape below clearly, but she imagined the grid of streets, the factories, the offices, all operating according to invisible rhythms, dependent on decisions she had never made, and often could not influence. The realization struck her again: stability was a fragile construct, provisional at best, an illusion most took for granted until disaster revealed the truth. The flight lasted 2 hours, crossing state lines, rivers, and industrial landscapes. When Helen stepped onto the tarmac, she found herself in a small Midwestern city she had never visited. The plane was met by a company liaison who spoke little, only gesturing for her to follow. They drove in silence through streets lined with shuttered factories, closed storefronts, and signs of economic strain. Helen observed carefully, the city was a microcosm of the forces she had been navigating in Chicago, magnified by isolation and scarcity. Supply chain disruptions, local layoffs, and market shifts had created a fragile ecosystem, each decision echoing through the community. The destination was a manufacturing plant recently acquired by Helen's firm. The executive summons became clear: the plant was underperforming, contracts were at risk, and immediate intervention was required to prevent financial collapse. Helen was briefed rapidly on operations, financial data, employee concerns, and pending deliveries. Errors had accumulated unnoticed for months, leaving the plant vulnerable to client penalties, supplier breaches, and potential closure. She realized that her previous successes in Chicago had prepared her for high stakes, but this was different. Here, decisions could mean the difference between solvency and ruin, stability and collapse. Helen spent the next several days immersed in the plant's operations. Employees were wary but cooperative, supervisors defensive yet relieved by her guidance. She reorganized production schedules, implemented quality control measures, and negotiated with clients and suppliers simultaneously. Every action had immediate consequences. A misstep could trigger delays, cost overruns, or layoffs. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing down, aware that the miller's future, tied partially to her compensation and strategic influence, now depended on the success of her intervention. Back in Ohio, George and Margaret sensed the tension in their correspondence with Helen. Phone calls were infrequent, letters terse. The family was learning, again, that the fragility of stability transcended distance. Helen's challenges were remote, yet every ripple affected the family's sense of security. George monitored investments cautiously, Margaret adjusted budgets with meticulous care, and Robert prepared to pursue higher education, understanding that in a world so reliant on fragile systems, personal initiative was crucial. On the third day, Helen faced a critical choice. One of the plant's major clients demanded a production increase within an impossibly short time frame, threatening to cancel the contract otherwise. Fulfilling the order required extraordinary coordination, additional shifts, and rapid procurement of scarce materials. Helen calculated risk versus reward. Meeting the client's demand could solidify revenue and reputation, but failure might lead to penalties, employee layoffs, and permanent damage to the firm's credibility. The decision was immediate, unavoidable, and unavoidable in its potential consequences. She acted. Overnight shifts were implemented, suppliers contacted, and production recalibrated. Helen worked alongside employees, troubleshooting machinery, adjusting schedules, and negotiating logistics with unrelenting focus. The operation teetered on the edge, each hour bringing the possibility of success or failure. She felt the strain physically, emotionally, and mentally, but also recognized the rare clarity that comes from absolute necessity. Every decision mattered, every second counted. By the end of the fourth day, results began to emerge. Production targets were met, contracts preserved, and employee morale stabilized. Helen had navigated the immediate crisis, yet she understood that this was temporary, a reprieve in a system governed by volatility, human error, and external forces beyond control. She recognized a larger lesson: in a world of hidden pressures, adaptability and foresight were as critical as knowledge or skill. Stability was always provisional, fragile, and subject to disruption. News of her success reached Ohio. George and Margaret experienced relief, yet remained vigilant. They had learned, through decades of incremental crises, that apparent stability could evaporate suddenly, and that reliance on a single person, system, or strategy was dangerous. Robert, inspired by Helen's resilience, intensified his studies and began networking with mentors and professionals, understanding that personal agency was a critical hedge against systemic instability. Then, on the fifth day, Helen received a confidential report from plant supervisors. Discrepancies persisted in accounting and inventory management. Certain materials were unaccounted for, minor fraud was suspected among mid-level employees. Helen realized the problem was deeper than initial assessments indicated. Corrective measures had stabilized operations temporarily, but systemic vulnerabilities remained. She faced a difficult choice: escalate the issue immediately, risking panic and employee distrust, or investigate discreetly, risking further exposure if the problem worsened. Helen chose discretion. She assembled a small, trusted team to audit operations quietly, tracking irregularities, documenting findings, and implementing subtle controls to prevent further misappropriation. This strategy minimized immediate disruption but required constant vigilance, careful judgment, and calculated risk-taking. Helen understood, more than ever, that leadership in complex systems demanded not only skill and intelligence, but the ability to navigate ambiguity, uncertainty, and ethical tension simultaneously. By early 1977, the plant's operations were significantly stabilized, thanks largely to Helen's intervention. Yet the crisis had left its mark. Helen was exhausted, chronically vigilant, and aware that each success carried new responsibilities, increased scrutiny, and amplified consequences. Stability, she realized, was a constant negotiation between skill, risk, and the unpredictable forces shaping human systems. Back in Ohio, George and Margaret faced renewed challenges. The continued erosion of retirement savings, combined with local economic uncertainty, underscored the fragility of plans that once seemed secure. They understood that their daughter's achievements in Chicago were not merely personal successes, they were integral to the family's survival strategy. Robert, now enrolled in college, studied finance, economics, and organizational behavior with renewed determination, seeking the tools to navigate the same forces that had tested Helen and their parents. Then, a sudden development arrived. Helen's executive liaison called with an urgent message. The parent company had identified a potential acquisition target, a firm struggling with compliance and operational inefficiency, and Helen was to lead the integration. The task promised influence, visibility, and potential financial gain, but carried immense risk. Missteps could jeopardize contracts, damage relationships, or result in public scrutiny. Helen faced the familiar tension, opportunity and peril, closely intertwined. As she prepared for the next phase, Helen reflected on the journey from Ohio to Chicago, from initial uncertainty to high-stakes leadership. Every lesson learned, the fragility of stability, the interplay between personal initiative and systemic forces, the limits of foresight, had been reinforced by lived experience. She recognized that her family's long-term security, like that of millions of Americans, was contingent on the ability to navigate volatility, seize opportunity, and confront unforeseen challenges with intelligence and courage. And yet, as she packed her suitcase once more, the city outside pulsed with the indifferent rhythm of markets, traffic, and life, forces larger than any individual, yet intimately connected to her choices. Helen understood that the path ahead would test her again, in ways she could not yet anticipate, with consequences extending far beyond herself, reaching back to Ohio, to the Millers' fragile financial foundation, and forward into the uncertain future that every family must confront. The car arrived at the airport once more. Helen glanced out at the city skyline, its lights shimmering like distant, indifferent stars. She inhaled deeply, bracing herself for the next journey. The storm, invisible yet omnipresent, was far from over. Helen is tasked with leading a high-risk corporate acquisition that could secure or imperil both her career and the family's financial stability, leaving the audience in suspense. The early morning sun painted Chicago in pale gold, reflecting off the mirrored glass of towering skyscrapers, yet for Helen, the beauty was secondary to the pressure pressing on every nerve. The acquisition target was a mid-sized manufacturing firm in a neighboring state, struggling with compliance issues, operational inefficiencies, and financial instability. For Helen, the task was clear in scope but enormous in consequence: stabilize the firm, integrate its operations into the parent company, preserve contracts, and secure revenue streams. Failure could ripple through her career, the company, and indirectly, the miller's fragile financial foundation. Helen arrived at the firm's headquarters mid-morning. The building's worn facade hinted at a history of decline, peeling paint, creaking floors, and outdated machinery. Employees were anxious, aware that acquisition often meant layoffs, restructuring, and disruption. Helen's presence was met with polite skepticism. She observed quietly, listening to supervisors, cataloging inefficiencies, and noting employee morale. She recognized patterns reminiscent of her first Chicago assignment, yet amplified. The stakes were higher, the network of dependencies larger, and the tolerance for error far smaller. Within hours, Helen confronted the first major challenge. Inventory discrepancies indicated that significant materials had been misallocated or misreported. Client contracts were at risk, and some suppliers had already expressed frustration at delays. Helen realized immediately that swift intervention was required. She called a meeting with department heads, carefully framing the discussion to avoid panic while conveying urgency. Her tone balanced authority with empathy, demonstrating a recognition of both operational realities and human factors. Over the next several days, Helen coordinated a complex web of actions: audits of materials, reassignment of staff, renegotiation with suppliers, and direct engagement with clients. She implemented new processes for reporting and accountability, ensuring that each step minimized disruption while addressing systemic vulnerabilities. Every decision carried immediate consequences. A scheduling error, a miscommunication, or a misjudgment could trigger contract breaches or layoffs, amplifying the human and financial stakes. Back in Ohio, George and Margaret followed the unfolding events with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Helen's correspondence was brief, coated with the intensity of someone navigating high-stakes corporate terrain. The family understood that her successes were essential not just for her own career, but for preserving the Millers' collective security. Robert, inspired by Helen's example, began pursuing internships and networking opportunities, aware that the tools to navigate such volatility were learned, not inherited. By midweek, Helen faced a more subtle, insidious challenge: resistance from within. A group of mid-level managers, protective of their authority, hesitated to implement her directives fully. Some employees, fearful of change, resisted new workflows. Helen recognized that organizational culture could be as formidable an obstacle as financial instability. She adapted her approach, leveraging negotiation, diplomacy, and subtle incentives, balancing firmness with collaboration. Gradually, compliance improved, morale stabilized, and operations began to show measurable improvement. Yet, the external environment added new pressure. One major client, learning of the acquisition, threatened to terminate their contract, citing uncertainty about the firm's capacity to meet deadlines. Helen immediately assessed the risks and opportunities. Meeting the client's demand could cement trust, expand revenue, and demonstrate competence. Failure would jeopardize contracts, reputations, and operational stability. She organized a rapid response team, implementing schedule adjustments, quality control measures, and direct communication with the client to reassure them. At the same time, the parent company's board requested continuous updates, scrutinizing every decision, transaction, and outcome. Helen was acutely aware that her actions were being evaluated not just for efficiency, but for strategic judgment, reliability, and the capacity to navigate complex human and systemic dynamics. Mistakes could end her career or weaken the Millers' financial safety net. Success, however, would provide leverage, influence, and a measure of control in an unpredictable world. By the end of the first week, operations were stabilizing, but Helen knew the crisis was far from over. The firm remained vulnerable to supply chain disruptions, financial inconsistencies, and market fluctuations. Each decision she made was intertwined with larger forces, economic policies, competitor actions, and even global trade dynamics. Helen realized that she was no longer simply managing a plant, she was navigating a nexus of interdependent systems, where outcomes were probabilistic rather than certain. Late one evening, Helen reviewed financial statements and client contracts alone in the office. The numbers revealed an alarming pattern: several late payments, misreported expenses, and discrepancies that suggested both human error and possible fraud. She understood that if left unaddressed, these issues could unravel the firm's recovery and destabilize the acquisition. But acting too aggressively risked alienating staff and clients. Helen's mind raced through potential strategies: a targeted audit, discreet investigations, or confronting the anomalies head-on in a high-level meeting. Meanwhile, George and Margaret confronted their own challenges in Ohio. The family's savings were under increasing pressure from inflation, healthcare costs, and home maintenance. Every decision Helen made in Chicago had the potential to impact the family's security. Margaret managed household finances with surgical precision, while George considered consulting with financial advisors to mitigate exposure. The Millers understood that security, once assumed, required constant vigilance, adaptation, and sometimes, sacrifice. Helen opted for a discreet approach. She formed a small investigative team within the firm, working closely with trustworthy supervisors to audit operations, reconcile accounts, and address inefficiencies. Progress was slow, requiring careful balance between transparency and discretion, but it gradually stabilized the firm's internal operations. Helen learned anew the delicate balance of leadership: influence without coercion, intervention without alienation, and foresight without certainty. Just as Helen felt a measure of control returning, a new challenge emerged. A regional regulator requested an unscheduled compliance audit, citing concerns about procedural adherence and financial reporting. Helen realized immediately that any misstep could trigger fines, legal scrutiny, or delays in contract fulfillment. She coordinated responses with legal counsel, departmental managers, and client liaisons, crafting a strategy that balanced compliance with operational continuity. Every hour was critical, every decision magnified the consequences not just for the firm, but for her career and the family's financial security. The audit concluded without immediate penalties, but Helen recognized the underlying lesson: external systems, regulatory, financial, social, could amplify vulnerabilities, turning small oversights into major crises. Stability was always conditional, and success required constant awareness, adaptation, and careful management of both human and systemic factors. By the end of the month, Helen's interventions had stabilized the acquisition target, secured client contracts, and ensured compliance. Yet the intensity had taken a toll. She felt fatigue, tension, and an acute awareness of her limited control over forces beyond her influence. Chicago had taught her that opportunity and risk were inseparable, Ohio had prepared her for vigilance, and now, navigating the acquisition, she fully understood the precarious nature of stability in a world governed by interconnected, unpredictable forces. As Helen prepared to return to Chicago, she received a final message from her executive liaison. Congratulations on stabilization. Next phase, integration with headquarters. Prepare for immediate transition. Helen exhaled slowly, recognizing that the cycle of pressure, responsibility, and risk was far from over. The family's future, the company's stability, and her own capacity for leadership would continue to be tested in unforeseen ways. And as she gazed out at the city skyline one last time before departure, she understood with crystal clarity: stability was never given, it was earned, defended, and constantly renegotiated. The illusion of security had been stripped away, leaving only vigilance, courage, and adaptability as guides through a world where every choice echoed far beyond immediate perception. Helen is instructed to lead the next phase, integration of the acquired firm with headquarters, setting the stage for high-stakes corporate and personal consequences that could dramatically impact the Millers' stability. Helen returned to Chicago with little rest, the hum of the city greeting her like an indifferent sentinel. The integration phase was more complex than any previous challenge. The acquired firm's operations, workforce, and culture had to align seamlessly with headquarters, yet resistance, inefficiency, and uncertainty permeated every layer. Helen understood that this was not merely a technical task, it was a human and systemic negotiation, a delicate balance between authority, diplomacy, and strategic foresight. Her first day back was consumed by assessments. Teams were assembled, workflows mapped, financial statements scrutinized, and compliance protocols compared. Helen noted subtle discrepancies: reporting structures differed, operational metrics were inconsistent, and employee morale was fragile. The acquisition's promises of efficiency and revenue now collided with the reality of human behavior, local culture, and systemic inertia. Every decision she made carried amplified consequences, echoing across the firm and, indirectly, back to the Millers' Ohio home. Within days, Helen faced her first integration crisis. A critical software system used for inventory management at the acquired plant was incompatible with headquarters operations. The risk was immediate: production delays, miscommunication with suppliers, and potential contract breaches. Helen convened cross-functional teams, aligning IT specialists, plant managers, and client representatives. The solution required both technical precision and decisive coordination, as delays could cascade into financial and reputational damage. Meanwhile, George and Margaret monitored Helen's progress from Ohio, receiving terse updates through phone calls and letters. The family's reliance on Helen's success had intensified. George adjusted investments cautiously, aware that any disruption in Helen's income or influence could affect their financial stability. Margaret tightened the household budget, planning for contingencies, while Robert, inspired by Helen's resilience, focused on developing skills that could provide his own buffer against uncertainty. The first month of integration was a study in complexity. Helen implemented new reporting systems, aligned operational schedules, and negotiated with skeptical staff resistant to change. She discovered pockets of inefficiency that had persisted for years: duplicated tasks, unclear accountability, and a culture of informal, undocumented processes. Each inefficiency represented potential financial loss, risk of contract violation, or operational bottleneck. Helen realized the stakes were not abstract, they were tangible, immediate, and consequential. Then, a more subtle threat emerged. Senior managers at the acquired firm began lobbying against certain operational changes, fearing loss of influence or reprisal. Helen recognized that resistance was not solely procedural, it was political, human, and rooted in fear. To succeed, she needed more than technical solutions. She needed trust, credibility, and the ability to navigate interpersonal dynamics with precision. Meetings became exercises in negotiation, persuasion, and careful observation, each decision carrying amplified consequences. Amid these challenges, Helen identified a hidden risk. Several client contracts contained clauses that could trigger penalties if minor deviations occurred. Production schedules, inventory allocation, and reporting standards now had legal and financial implications beyond their apparent scope. Helen spent long hours poring over contracts, consulting legal counsel, and designing contingency plans to mitigate exposure. She understood, viscerally, that stability required constant vigilance and proactive action, and that even minor oversights could have outsized consequences. By mid-quarter, early successes had begun to emerge. Inventory systems were synchronized, employee workflows clarified, and client communication stabilized. Yet Helen felt the relentless weight of responsibility. Integration was not a linear process. Progress was punctuated by unforeseen obstacles, human error, and market volatility. Each day demanded acute awareness, adaptability, and rapid decision-making. The pressure was unrelenting, and failure at any point could reverberate across the company and back to the Millers' Ohio household. Then came a late-night call from the plant manager of the acquired firm. A key shipment destined for an international client was delayed due to customs complications. The shipment contained specialized machinery, contracts were tight, and any delay could trigger financial penalties and reputational damage. Helen recognized the pattern. Despite her best efforts, systemic forces, governmental regulations, logistical networks, human error, could destabilize even the most carefully managed operations. She acted immediately, coordinating with customs officials, shipping companies, and client representatives to expedite delivery while documenting every step to protect the firm legally. Simultaneously, Helen faced ethical dilemmas. Certain practices at the acquired firm, previously overlooked, violated internal compliance standards. She could ignore them temporarily to ensure operational continuity, or confront them, risking disruption but upholding integrity. Helen chose the latter. Implementing corrective measures required delicate negotiation with local managers, incremental policy changes, and close monitoring to prevent resistance from escalating. Each step was a tightrope walk. Too aggressive, and operations might falter; too lenient, and risks would accumulate. Back in Ohio, George and Margaret felt the tension through Helen's updates. Their reliance on her had become a structural element of the family's security. Every letter, every phone call was scrutinized, each word weighted for insight into the unfolding complexities. Robert, increasingly aware of systemic risks, pursued internships and mentorships to acquire skills that would allow him to navigate the same challenges in the future. The family's collective experience underscored the precarious nature of financial and operational stability, and the importance of adaptability, foresight, and initiative. By late spring, Helen had achieved measurable progress. Integration metrics improved, client satisfaction stabilized, and operational risks were mitigated. Yet she knew the work was far from over. Systems remained fragile, human resistance persisted, and external forces, economic shifts, policy changes, market fluctuations, continued to exert pressure. Helen realized that in both Chicago and Ohio, the illusion of stability had been shattered. True security was a constant negotiation, requiring vigilance, foresight, and a willingness to act decisively amid uncertainty. Then, one afternoon, an unexpected message arrived. A major supplier informed Helen of potential bankruptcy, threatening critical components for several contracts. The situation demanded immediate attention. Alternative sources had to be identified, logistics recalculated, and client expectations managed. Helen mobilized her team, creating a rapid response framework to mitigate disruption. She worked late into the night, coordinating contingencies, analyzing risk, and implementing solutions that balanced urgency with precision. The crisis revealed another truth: opportunity and risk were inseparable. Each solution introduced new variables, potential points of failure, and human factors that could destabilize progress. Helen's decisions affected not only operational metrics but also the well-being of employees, the satisfaction of clients, and the financial security of her family. Every choice was a negotiation with uncertainty itself, a confrontation with forces far larger than any individual. By evening, the immediate crisis was contained. Shipments were rerouted, supplier contracts renegotiated, and client communications maintained. Yet Helen understood that this resolution was temporary. Stability, she realized, was not a state but a process, an ongoing engagement with systems, people, and circumstances that could shift at any moment. The lesson was clear: security was provisional, contingent on awareness, adaptability, and strategic foresight. As Helen prepared to leave the plant for the night, the Chicago skyline glimmered through the window. The city moved with indifferent rhythm, unaware of the human dramas, calculations, and negotiations unfolding within its boundaries. Helen's thoughts turned briefly to Ohio, her parents, Robert, the home they had built, and the fragile scaffolding of security and opportunity connecting them all. She understood that her work in Chicago was inseparable from her family's survival, that every decision she made had consequences extending far beyond her immediate environment. Her phone buzzed with a final message from headquarters. Prepare for executive review. Major decisions incoming. Outcome will affect both integration and company strategy. Helen's stomach tightened. Another test loomed, a convergence of operational, financial, and human factors that could redefine her influence, the firm's stability, and the Millers' future. The rhythm of the city continued outside, relentless, indifferent, and yet intimately connected to the fate of a single family navigating forces far larger than themselves. And as Helen gazed out at the skyline, the weight of responsibility settled around her like a tangible presence. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with risk, and demanding courage, insight, and adaptability beyond anything she had previously faced. Helen is summoned for a high-stakes executive review that will determine the fate of the integration, her influence in the company, and the Millers' security, leaving the audience on edge. Helen stepped into the towering headquarters building, the lobby buzzing with energy, yet she felt an acute sense of isolation. Executives moved with practiced precision, conversations overlapped like an orchestrated hum, and the glass walls reflected the city's glow, indifferent to the weight of decisions unfolding inside. She understood immediately, this was more than a procedural review. The executive meeting would determine not only the success of the acquisition integration but also the trajectory of her influence, her career, and by extension, the Millers' fragile financial security. The boardroom was imposing. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, offering a view that was at once breathtaking and indifferent. Four senior executives sat at the polished table, their expressions carefully neutral. Helen was asked to present her findings, outline integration progress, and propose next steps. Every word would be scrutinized, every recommendation would be weighed against precedent, risk tolerance, and the company's strategic objectives. The stakes were immense. Helen began by detailing operational metrics. Inventory had been reconciled, workflows streamlined, and client contracts preserved. She highlighted improvements in efficiency, reductions in discrepancies, and measures taken to secure supplier relationships. The room was silent, the weight of each pause palpable. She continued with plans for ongoing integration, cross-functional teams, compliance monitoring, and contingency measures for potential disruptions. Every element was framed to demonstrate foresight, strategic judgment, and a nuanced understanding of both human and systemic factors. The executives listened intently, interjecting with pointed questions. One questioned the sustainability of operational improvements, another scrutinized client satisfaction metrics, while a third focused on financial risk exposure. Helen responded with precision, drawing on data, observations, and lessons learned during her months in Chicago and at the acquired firm. Her answers were measured, strategic, and unflinching, conveying confidence without arrogance. Yet midway through the review, an unexpected development emerged. A senior executive raised concerns about a supplier flagged as unstable in Helen's reports. The executive emphasized potential contractual penalties, reputational risk, and the possibility of public exposure. Helen realized immediately that this was no longer a question of internal metrics alone. External factors, market volatility, legal exposure, and public perception, were now entwined with every decision. She proposed a multifaceted mitigation strategy, alternative suppliers, risk-sharing agreements, and client communication protocols designed to maintain trust while minimizing disruption. The room shifted, the energy tense but controlled. Helen's proposals were evaluated against both short-term objectives and long-term strategy. The conversation highlighted a critical insight: even the most precise operational plans were vulnerable to external pressures, human behavior, and unforeseen contingencies. Helen recognized that leadership in complex systems was as much about anticipation, adaptability, and judgment as it was about technical skill. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, George and Margaret followed Helen's progress with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Letters and phone calls contained coded updates, revealing the stakes without disclosing confidential details. The family understood that Helen's influence in Chicago was inseparable from their financial and personal security. Robert, observing from college, internalized lessons about systemic vulnerability, personal initiative, and the interconnectedness of decisions across geography, hierarchy, and time. As the executive review continued, Helen was presented with a scenario simulation: sudden client withdrawal, supplier insolvency, and internal employee resistance occurring simultaneously. The executives asked for immediate contingency recommendations. Helen outlined layered strategies, balancing operational continuity, client satisfaction, and risk mitigation. She emphasized adaptive leadership, constant monitoring, rapid response, and proactive intervention. Her approach was both analytical and human-centered, recognizing that systems were shaped as much by behavior and morale as by financial and procedural metrics. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, an unexpected acknowledgement: the executives approved Helen's integration strategy, praising her foresight and operational skill. Yet the recognition was tempered by an unspoken truth: the responsibility now shifted entirely to her. Authority was granted, but with it came visibility, scrutiny, and amplified consequences. Helen understood that this was not a moment of relief but a transition into a new phase of high-stakes responsibility. Back in Ohio, George and Margaret felt a measure of relief tempered by ongoing vigilance. Their daughter's success had solidified operational stability and, by extension, their financial security, but the broader lesson remained: stability was provisional, contingent, and constantly tested by forces beyond individual control. Robert's studies reinforced the same principle: knowledge, initiative, and adaptability were critical defenses against systemic risk. The weeks following the executive review brought both progress and subtle tension. Helen oversaw the full integration of the acquired firm into headquarters operations, aligning teams, standardizing reporting, and implementing training programs to ensure compliance and efficiency. Metrics improved steadily, yet Helen remained vigilant. She recognized that success in complex systems was rarely permanent; it required ongoing adjustment, monitoring, and engagement with both human and procedural variables. Then, an unforeseen complication emerged. One of the acquired firm's long-term clients raised concerns about discrepancies in historical financial reporting, suggesting potential non-compliance with contractual obligations. Helen immediately convened her team, analyzing data, reviewing documents, and coordinating with legal counsel. The issue threatened not only revenue but credibility, highlighting the fragility of systems once thought secure. Helen's response was methodical and precise: corrective measures, transparent reporting, and proactive client engagement minimized immediate risk while reinforcing operational integrity. As Helen worked through the crisis, she reflected on the journey from Ohio to Chicago: the early lessons of financial vulnerability, the gradual understanding of systemic forces, and the lived experience of high-stakes corporate decision-making. Every challenge reinforced the central truth she had come to understand viscerally: stability was never guaranteed, opportunity carried inherent risk, and human systems, financial, organizational, or familial, were inherently fragile. By midsummer, the integration was largely successful. Helen's influence within the company solidified, and operational metrics indicated measurable improvement. Yet she knew the work was never complete. New challenges, market shifts, client demands, regulatory scrutiny, remained imminent, and every decision carried amplified consequences. Helen's vigilance was constant, her judgment tested daily, and her understanding of risk continually refined. Then, one late afternoon, a confidential note arrived at her desk. Unanticipated market disruption. Immediate evaluation required. Potential impact on operations and family security. Helen froze. The message was brief but urgent, signaling a new phase of complexity. The rhythm of corporate life, the stability of her integration work, and the Miller's security all hung in a delicate balance, contingent on her next actions. She realized that this was another crucible, a challenge that would test every lesson learned in Ohio, Chicago, and through the acquisition process. She looked out at the city skyline, the sun dipping behind the skyscrapers. The lights reflected on the river like sparks on dark water, indifferent to human effort, yet intimately connected to the choices of those navigating its systems. Helen understood that the path ahead would demand vigilance, judgment, and courage, qualities that had been honed through months of unrelenting challenges, and would continue to define both her career and the miller's future. Helen receives urgent notice of a potential market disruption threatening operations and the miller's financial security, leaving the audience anticipating how she will respond. Helen sat at her desk, the note from headquarters weighing heavily in her mind. Unanticipated market disruption. The words alone suggested consequences far beyond the immediate operational concerns of the integration. She reviewed her notes, contracts, and supply chains, searching for vulnerabilities, anticipating cascading effects, and weighing potential mitigation strategies. Every choice mattered, every delay could magnify risk. The stakes were personal and systemic: her career, the company's stability, and, quietly but unmistakably, her family's financial security in Ohio. By the next morning, Helen had convened an emergency task force. The disruption involved the key supplier's insolvency and the sudden volatility of a critical commodity affecting production across multiple divisions. She coordinated teleconferences with legal counsel, finance teams, procurement specialists, and regional managers. The task was labyrinthine: recalibrate contracts, adjust supply lines, maintain client satisfaction, and protect operational continuity, all under strict time constraints. Each decision had the potential to ripple outward, creating unforeseen consequences at every level. Back in Ohio, George and Margaret sensed tension through Helen's rare, clipped updates. Letters were brief, telephonic conversations hurried, and every word carefully chosen. The family's awareness of systemic vulnerability had been sharpened through months of exposure to risk: Helen's integration work, market fluctuations, and the gradual erosion of financial safeguards. Robert, increasingly independent in thought and action, studied risk management and strategic decision-making, drawing lessons from his sister's real-world challenges. The Millers had come to understand that security was not a static state, but a dynamic negotiation with uncertainty itself. Helen's task force identified immediate priorities: first, secure alternative suppliers for critical components; second, assess the financial exposure of clients and contracts; third, mitigate reputational risk through proactive communication. Helen understood that these objectives were interconnected: failure in one area could cascade into failure elsewhere. She divided responsibilities carefully, balancing expertise, authority, and accountability. The operations were intricate, the timeline unforgiving, and every choice demanded precision. Within hours, the first ripple effect became visible. One supplier, unable to meet demand due to liquidity constraints, threatened delays in delivery, jeopardizing several contracts. Helen initiated negotiations, leveraging relationships, clarifying expectations, and arranging staggered deliveries to minimize disruption. At the same time, she coordinated with finance teams to assess risk exposure, model potential losses, and prepare contingency plans. The work was exhaustive, the pressure unrelenting. Meanwhile, internal resistance emerged. Employees at the acquired firm, already fatigued from months of integration, expressed skepticism and concern over increased workloads. Helen addressed this carefully, balancing empathy with authority, providing clear communication, and implementing incremental incentives to encourage compliance. She understood that human factors could amplify systemic risk just as much as financial or logistical vulnerabilities. Leadership required both technical skill and psychological insight, an ability to anticipate responses, manage morale, and maintain focus amid uncertainty. By midweek, early mitigation measures had stabilized immediate operations. Alternative suppliers were secured, client communications maintained, and internal workflows adjusted. Yet Helen recognized that the broader disruption, the volatility in commodity prices and market sentiment, remained unresolved. Systems were fragile, dependent on forces beyond her immediate control: global trade, economic policy, and supplier solvency. Every decision she made was an attempt to navigate a web of uncertainty where even minor miscalculations could trigger disproportionate consequences. Back in Ohio, George and Margaret adjusted household finances further. The family's budget was already tight, constrained by inflation, medical expenses, and deferred maintenance. Helen's work, while providing critical income and influence, had become a source of stress and vigilance. Every decision she made in Chicago affected their real-world stability, reinforcing the family's understanding that safety was provisional, contingent, and constantly negotiated. Robert, taking cues from both parents and sister, focused on acquiring knowledge and skills to navigate volatile systems independently. Late one evening, Helen faced a pivotal decision. A major client demanded expedited production, but fulfilling the request would strain already stretched supply lines and risk quality control failures. Failure to comply could jeopardize contracts, revenue, and reputation. Helen analyzed the variables: supplier capacity, employee bandwidth, logistic constraints, and client priorities. She consulted with her task force, ran projections, and implemented a phased approach that balanced responsiveness with operational integrity. The decision was fraught with uncertainty, yet executed with precision and foresight. By the following day, results were cautiously positive. Production targets were met, client relationships preserved, and risk exposure mitigated. Helen allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction, understanding that temporary stability had been restored, but that the system remained vulnerable. She recognized the lesson repeated throughout her journey: stability was not a permanent state, opportunity carried inherent risk, and human and systemic forces were inseparable in shaping outcomes. Then came a new complication. Financial analysts reported a sudden, unanticipated fluctuation in market interest rates, threatening liquidity and affecting credit arrangements across multiple divisions. Helen realized that operational stability was now entangled with macroeconomic forces far beyond her immediate influence. She convened senior managers, assessed exposure, and implemented strategies to hedge risk, renegotiating credit terms, reallocating resources, and strengthening cash flow management. The work was precise, exhausting, and relentless. Back in Ohio, George and Margaret observed with growing concern. Each update from Helen signaled progress, but also new vulnerabilities. The family had internalized a profound understanding: safety, financial or otherwise, was an ongoing negotiation with unpredictability. They managed household expenses with rigor, preparing for potential disruptions, while Robert continued developing skills that could provide resilience against systemic uncertainty. By late summer, Helen had stabilized operations sufficiently to prevent immediate collapse. Yet she understood that her work was part of a perpetual cycle. Each resolution revealed latent vulnerabilities, and new risks emerged continuously. Stability, she realized, was provisional, dependent on vigilance, foresight, and capacity for rapid intervention. Opportunity was inseparable from risk, and control was never absolute. Then, in a quiet moment, Helen received a personal call from the parent company's CEO. The conversation was brief but pointed. "Helen, exceptional work so far. But the market's volatility is escalating. You'll need to implement a strategic plan to ensure long-term operational and financial stability. The family's reliance on your decisions is not unnoticed. Be prepared for intense scrutiny." Helen understood the implication. Her responsibilities now extended beyond operational integration and crisis management. She was accountable for long-term strategy, market navigation, and the ripple effects of every decision on both the company and the Millers' financial security. The burden was immense, the expectations explicit, and the margin for error minimal. As she hung up, Helen stared out at the Chicago skyline. The city shimmered, vibrant and indifferent, a living testament to human ambition, systemic complexity, and the fragility of perceived stability. She understood, once again, that the illusion of security had been stripped away. Every choice, every intervention, every decision carried weight far beyond immediate perception, shaping not only her life and career but the well-being of her family hundreds of miles away. The day ended with Helen drafting a comprehensive strategy for long-term stabilization, balancing risk mitigation, operational efficiency, and human factors. She worked late into the night, knowing that each decision was consequential, that oversight could unravel months of progress, and that the next phase would test every lesson learned in Ohio and Chicago. Helen is tasked with developing a long-term strategic plan to stabilize operations amid escalating market volatility, with implications that could profoundly affect both the company and her family's financial security. Helen sat at her desk, the city skyline beyond the glass a constant reminder of the scale and indifference of the systems she was navigating. The strategic plan she was tasked to implement was complex, multifaceted, and fraught with risk. It required balancing operational efficiency, financial stability, and human factors, all under the scrutiny of executives and with the Millers' financial security subtly intertwined. Every decision she made carried immediate and long-term consequences, and the margin for error was vanishingly small. She began by conducting a comprehensive risk assessment. Key vulnerabilities were identified: supply chain fragility, potential client attrition, regulatory compliance gaps, and internal resistance to new operational protocols. Each risk had cascading implications. Delays in one area could trigger contractual penalties, damage employee morale, or affect the company's reputation. Helen mapped these interactions meticulously, using historical data, market analysis, and lessons learned from prior crises. She understood that long-term stability was less about control and more about anticipating ripple effects across complex, interdependent systems. Internal challenges arose quickly. Some managers remained skeptical of the new strategic protocols, questioning both feasibility and potential impact on their departments. Helen addressed this through a combination of targeted communication, transparent rationale, and incremental implementation. She balanced firmness with empathy, ensuring that compliance was achieved without alienating critical personnel. In doing so, she reinforced a principle she had learned over months of high-stakes decision-making: human factors were as consequential as financial or operational variables. Meanwhile, in Ohio, George and Margaret monitored the family's exposure closely. Helen's income and influence were increasingly critical to preserving the Millers' long-term security. Budget adjustments, cautious investments, and contingency planning were ongoing exercises, illustrating that even personal stability was intertwined with the dynamics of distant, high-stakes corporate systems. Robert, now deeply aware of systemic risk and the fragility of assumed security, continued his studies with a focus on financial modeling, strategic decision-making, and crisis management. The family's collective experience underscored a central truth: stability was provisional and required continuous engagement with uncertainty. As Helen implemented her plan, an external shock struck. A key supplier announced partial insolvency, threatening critical components for ongoing production. The disruption had immediate operational, financial, and contractual implications. Helen mobilized her team, identifying alternative suppliers, negotiating staggered deliveries, and adjusting production schedules to prevent cascading failure. Every decision was made under pressure, with consequences extending beyond operations to client satisfaction, employee morale, and corporate credibility. Simultaneously, market volatility intensified. Interest rates fluctuated unpredictably, affecting liquidity and credit arrangements. Helen coordinated with financial teams to renegotiate terms, hedge risk, and ensure that cash flow remained sufficient to maintain operations. She recognized that external economic forces were as critical as internal management in determining stability, and that success required constant vigilance and proactive strategy. Midway through the implementation phase, a subtle but insidious challenge appeared. Pockets of employee resistance persisted, some employees deliberately delaying reports or circumventing protocols. Helen convened targeted discussions, addressing concerns directly while reinforcing accountability. She recognized that resistance was not simply obstinacy but often rooted in fear, uncertainty, and habit. Leadership, she understood, required negotiation, empathy, and decisiveness, qualities that could determine whether a strategic plan succeeded or failed. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act. Helen maintained operational continuity while adjusting strategies in real time to accommodate shifting circumstances. Supply chains were reinforced, financial exposure minimized, and client communication sustained. Every victory was measured, deliberate, and provisional, highlighting the continuous nature of systemic management. Even minor miscalculations could trigger disproportionate effects, underscoring the fragility of both organizational and personal stability. In Ohio, the family observed with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Helen's successes stabilized immediate financial exposure, but the underlying lesson was clear: security was never guaranteed, and each generation's well-being depended on adaptability, foresight, and informed decision-making. Robert applied these insights academically and practically, seeking internships and mentorships to understand the interplay of human and systemic factors that defined resilience. George and Margaret's experience reinforced the understanding that vigilance, planning, and resourcefulness were essential defenses against the uncertainty that permeated both corporate and personal life. Then came an unforeseen development. One of the firm's long-term clients identified a discrepancy in reporting, raising concerns about compliance and contractual obligations. The issue threatened revenue, credibility, and operational stability. Helen acted swiftly, coordinating legal review, internal audits, and client communication. Her response was proactive, transparent, and precise, addressing the discrepancy while mitigating potential disruption. The incident reinforced the recurring lesson: stability was never a given, and every operational success could be destabilized by human, procedural, or external factors. As summer waned, Helen's strategic plan began to show measurable results. Operational efficiency improved, financial exposure was minimized, and employee compliance increased. Yet she remained acutely aware that this stability was provisional, dependent on constant monitoring, rapid response, and strategic foresight. Opportunity and risk, she understood, were inseparable. Every operational decision carried the potential for both gain and disruption, and success required continuous engagement with uncertainty. Late one evening, Helen received a confidential executive communication. "Helen, your strategic plan has stabilized operations, but further market shocks are expected. Prepare for proactive scenario planning. The miller's exposure is significant, as you know." The reminder was stark: her work was far from complete, and consequences extended beyond corporate walls. The family's security, intertwined with her decisions, was contingent on her ability to anticipate and manage both human and systemic risk. Helen understood the gravity, but also the necessity of resilience, foresight, and courage. In response, Helen developed a layered scenario plan. Each potential disruption, supply chain failure, client withdrawal, regulatory challenge, market volatility, was analyzed for probability, impact, and contingency measures. Resources were allocated preemptively, communication protocols refined, and response teams positioned to act rapidly. The exercise was exhaustive, strategic, and rigorous, highlighting the complexity of systemic management and the interdependence of operational, financial, and human factors. By early autumn, Helen's plan had not only stabilized the acquired firm but also positioned the organization for resilience against future disruptions. Yet she understood that this was not a conclusion but a transitional phase. Systems remained vulnerable, human behavior unpredictable, and external forces beyond control. Stability, she reflected, was not an endpoint but a continuous negotiation with uncertainty, a practice in vigilance, foresight, and decisive action. Then, one evening, as Helen reviewed operational metrics, a final message arrived from headquarters. Helen, your work has secured immediate and long-term stability. Prepare to brief the board on lessons learned and future recommendations. The weight of months of decisions, crises, and strategic navigation pressed upon her. Helen knew the briefing would mark both the culmination of her efforts and a transition into a new phase of professional and personal responsibility. The miller's security, the firm's resilience, and the integrity of operational systems were intertwined, a testament to the fragile but navigable nature of stability in a complex world. She looked out at the city, lights reflecting on the river like sparks on dark water. The hum of life below continued, indifferent yet connected to her choices, her vigilance, and her actions. Helen understood that the journey of managing uncertainty, risk, and opportunity was ongoing, but for the first time, the illusion of control had given way to a practiced mastery of adaptive, resilient leadership. Helen prepares to brief the board on the results of her strategic interventions and the lessons learned from months of navigating operational, financial, and systemic crises, setting the stage for the story's resolution. The boardroom was quiet, the muted hum of the city outside a distant backdrop to the tension within. Helen stepped forward, her reports and presentations meticulously organized, every data point cross-referenced, every contingency plan accounted for. The executive's eyes were focused, evaluating not just her findings but her judgment, her foresight, and the subtle interplay between operational success and strategic vision. Helen began with a straightforward assessment. She outlined the integration process, the stabilization of workflows, reconciliation of inventory and financial discrepancies, alignment of reporting protocols, and measures implemented to secure supplier and client relationships. Her presentation was precise but nuanced, blending quantitative metrics with qualitative observations. Employee morale, human factors, and cultural adaptation were highlighted alongside financial and operational results. The board listened intently. One executive interjected, questioning long-term resilience in the face of market volatility. Helen responded with layered scenario analyses, demonstrating contingency strategies, proactive risk mitigation, and adaptive protocols designed to absorb shocks without destabilizing the system. Each recommendation reflected months of observation, rapid response, and careful management of both human and systemic variables. She moved to lessons learned. The first was clear: stability was provisional. Systems, corporate, economic, or familial, were vulnerable to minor disruptions that could cascade into major crises. The second, human behavior could amplify or mitigate risk. Effective leadership required empathy, negotiation, and the ability to anticipate resistance or cooperation. The third, foresight and adaptability were inseparable from operational execution. Success depended on monitoring interdependent factors, anticipating ripple effects, and intervening decisively when necessary. The board was silent for a moment. Then the CEO spoke. Helen, your work demonstrates a level of strategic insight and operational execution that exceeds expectations. Not only have you stabilized the integration, but you've also built resilience into the organization for the long term. Well done. Helen exhaled quietly. Months of relentless pressure, high-stakes decision-making, and constant vigilance had culminated in recognition and approval. Yet she understood that the outcome was not merely a personal achievement, it was the result of carefully navigating human dynamics, systemic interdependence, and external uncertainty, all while safeguarding the well-being of her family hundreds of miles away. Back in Ohio, George and Margaret received Helen's updates with a profound sense of relief. The family's financial exposure, previously precarious, was now buffered by her success. The home they had maintained, the savings they had preserved, and the investments they had cautiously made now carried renewed significance. Robert, observing the culmination of his sister's efforts, internalized lessons about strategic foresight, adaptability, and the fragility of assumed security. The family had not merely survived, they had emerged more resilient and informed. Helen's presentation concluded with recommendations for ongoing monitoring and adaptation. She emphasized that no system was immune to volatility, and that continuous engagement with risk, human behavior, and operational dynamics was essential. Leadership, she reminded the board, was not about controlling every variable but about managing interdependence with precision, foresight, and vigilance. The executives nodded in understanding. The integration was complete, operational stability had been restored, and the company was positioned to respond proactively to future disruptions. Yet the subtle lesson lingered: success was never absolute, security was never guaranteed, and the illusion of permanence was easily shattered by unforeseen forces. After the board meeting, Helen returned to her office. The city skyline glimmered, indifferent yet intimately connected to the consequences of her decisions. She reflected on the journey, the early lessons from Ohio, the challenges of acquisition, the high-stakes integration, and the market disruption. Each phase had tested her judgment, resilience, and capacity to navigate uncertainty. Each challenge had reminded her of the provisional nature of stability and the inseparability of opportunity and risk. Helen allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought of her parents, George and Margaret, who had managed household stability with care and foresight. She thought of Robert, whose awareness of systemic risk and personal initiative had grown alongside the family's experience. She realized that the journey had not only shaped her professional identity but had also reinforced the bonds and resilience of the family itself. Operational stability had been restored, financial risks mitigated, and systemic vulnerabilities addressed, yet Helen knew that vigilance must continue. The lessons of the past months, foresight, adaptability, empathy, and decisive action, would guide her in the years ahead. Stability, she understood, was not a state but a practice, a continual engagement with uncertainty, a negotiation with risk, and an unwavering commitment to thoughtful intervention. In Ohio, the Millers gathered for a quiet evening together. George and Margaret shared reflections on the months of tension and vigilance, acknowledging both the fragility and resilience of the structures they had maintained. Robert spoke with newfound understanding of risk, leadership, and systemic interdependence. The family recognized that security was provisional, yet their shared experience had strengthened their ability to navigate complexity, uncertainty, and challenge. Helen returned home the following weekend. The reunion was quiet but profound. The family shared meals, stories, and the relief of survival tempered by awareness. Their journey had been a crucible, testing personal resilience, professional judgment, and systemic understanding. Yet in facing each challenge, they had acquired tools, foresight, adaptability, strategic thinking, and emotional resilience, that would serve them long after the immediate crises had passed. Helen reflected on the broader implications of her experience. The challenges of integration, market disruption, and operational management were mirrors of larger truths, that security was conditional, opportunity inseparable from risk, and human and systemic factors inseparable in shaping outcomes. Her family's experience became a case study in vigilance, adaptability, and strategic foresight, a testament to the subtle but powerful interplay of personal action and systemic forces. As evening descended, Helen and her family gathered by the fireplace. The city outside continued its indifferent rhythm, but inside, there was a sense of hard-earned equilibrium. The journey had revealed vulnerabilities, illuminated human and systemic complexity, and tested resilience at every level. Yet it had also provided clarity, competence, and a renewed appreciation for the delicate architecture of stability. Helen's final reflection was simple, yet profound: security is not inherited or assumed, it is constructed through vigilance, informed action, and the willingness to confront uncertainty with courage and insight. The Millers had learned, through months of challenge and triumph, that the illusion of stability is easily shattered, but that resilience, foresight, and adaptability are enduring. In that quiet room, with the family gathered around her, Helen understood that the journey had not merely preserved their security, it had transformed it. They were no longer passive participants in a world governed by uncertainty, they were active navigators, equipped to face the next challenges with awareness, skill, and courage. The city outside glimmered with lights, indifferent and eternal, yet intimately connected to the choices, actions, and vigilance of one family who had faced the illusion of security, and emerged prepared, resilient, and informed. The Millers' financial and personal security is preserved, Helen's career is solidified, and the family emerges resilient, with a profound understanding of risk, systemic interdependence, and the provisional nature of stability. The story concludes with clarity, reflection, and a sense of informed preparedness, without leaving unresolved threads. The city lights shimmered against the river, reflections fragmented like the complex threads of a life lived at the intersection of choice, risk, and circumstance. Helen's journey had carried her through boardrooms, factories, and family homes, navigating challenges that were simultaneously operational, financial, and deeply human. She had learned that stability was never guaranteed, that every decision rippled outward, and that resilience required foresight, vigilance, and courage. In Ohio, the Millers settled into a quiet evening, the tension of uncertainty slowly giving way to a fragile, hard-won sense of security. George and Margaret reflected on the months of careful planning, adaptation, and watchful attention, recognizing that safety was a practice, not a given. Robert, inspired by his sister's example, carried forward the lessons of systemic awareness, strategic thinking, and personal responsibility, tools that would shape the rest of his life. The story of one family was, in many ways, a mirror of a broader truth. The structures we rely on, financial, professional, personal, are provisional, contingent, and vulnerable to forces beyond our perception. Yet within that fragility lies opportunity. With awareness, preparedness, and adaptability, it is possible to navigate uncertainty, mitigate risk, and reclaim agency in a world defined by complexity. Helen gazed out once more at the skyline, understanding that the journey was never truly complete. Stability, security, and resilience were ongoing negotiations, lived in moments of decision, reflection, and action. And in that understanding, she, and the Millers, had found something enduring, not the illusion of safety, but the power to confront uncertainty with insight, courage, and unwavering presence.